Welcome to the Doctors of Running virtual roundtable, where we, a group of doctors of physical therapy, discuss the art and science of running and the stuff that we're putting on our feet. It is episode number 91 today, and we have a full roundtable. We have Matt Klein, if you've heard of him. We have David Salas, we have Andrea Myers, and then myself. We are really excited. Andrea is going to be a part of the podcast on a very regular basis moving forward. She's going to have at least one appearance a month, and we're really excited for her to push some of her specific areas of interest, her special knowledge. If you don't know about Andrea, you should go read about her, because she was a professional cyclist for a while and then just decides, I'm going to go run a 304 marathon because that's fun. So she has so much experience in the high performance world, works professional bike fitting. I suppose you could tell more about yourself, but I just think that she's a great asset to the roundtable, and excited to have her as a part of this episode. Today we have a very traditional outline of what we're going to do. First, we're going to go through a running shoe review. We're going to talk about the New Balance SC Pacer, SuperComp Pacer. This is a shoe that's kind of part of a new trend, I'm going to put new in quotations, new trend, where we're seeing these companies put out these huge, high-stacked racing shoes for marathons, and now we're starting to see shoes that aren't really low stack. They're still high in stack, but lower than these elite marathon shoes that have slightly lower stack, still have a lot of the same foams, same plates, just slightly different geometries. And we're going to talk about kind of where do these fit, what's the purpose, that kind of thing. And then we're going to go into our main segment for the day, which is a biomechanical topic. We're going to talk about the importance of hip extension in runners. We'll talk about why is it important? What does it give the runner? What happens if you don't have it? What sort of compensations or issues? What are some of the consequences if you don't? And we'll maybe talk about a couple tips into if you are lacking hip extension, or if you want to check how you're lacking hip extension. We'll try to give some tips along the way. Before we do any of that, we are going to do our subjective, and since we're talking about the New Balance SuperComp Pacer, the question for everybody is, do you have a performance trainer or a workout shoe? What is it? Or if you don't have one, and you just do everything in one shoe, why don't you have one? What's your rationale for choosing just one shoe? And do you like working out in heavier shoes on purpose? So that's the question for everybody today, but we are going to go right into our SuperComp Pacer review. So, let's just talk a little bit about the general makeup of this shoe. Maybe somebody can give us some specs, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, at least on the men's side, the specs aren't super specific, but
right.
We don't really have any heel or forefoot measurements, but I believe it's about 8mm drop, and then 6.9 ounces, men's size 9.
Yep.
So that's all the information we got, and FuelCell, midsole, and all that stuff, but...
Yeah, I think the women's comes in just under 6 ounces, which is pretty awesome. But I'm not aware of any other stack information either.
Yeah, even when we reached out to New Balance to get a little bit more information, they kind of hold the information, the cards kind of close to the chest, which is respectable. We get that. I do think we're going to get some pictures into some of the other stuff coming up in this summer, and we're excited to talk more about it. I think there's a couple other things that are apparent in the shoe. They have some branding on it, like Energy Arc, and that's referring to the shaping of the plate, where typically a shape might have sort of a spoon shaping where it angles down towards the ground and then back up. This one has kind of an arc effect where starts in the heel, it goes up a little bit and then back down. And so we can talk about what their goals are with that and why it may or may not do something. It kind of makes me think of cross-country skis, kind of in the shaping where when they sit on the ground, they're kind of arced and just the two ends are touching. But I'd say that's the other major info. But let's talk about fit. What's the upper like? David, I know you're down a half size because I sent you my pair, but what would you guys say in terms of fit?
I can tell you, New Balance sent me a 10, and normally in New Balance shoes I wear a 9.5, but I'm really glad they sent me a 10 actually, because the fit was one of the best fitting shoes I've tried. It definitely has a little more room than a lot of performance shoes, but I think that made it work well for some of my longer workouts. I definitely have a full thumbs width from like the front of my big toe to the front of the shoe. The width is great. Definitely have some room for toe splay. The upper is this really nice thin mesh. And it's just so breathable. There's no like pinch points on the shoe anywhere. I really, really enjoy running in this shoe. I just did a 12-mile workout in it yesterday and was just reminded of how much I enjoy training it. And I'm now trying to decide if I want to do my 5K next weekend in it, or if I should stick with the Vaporfly, which we were talking about earlier in our chat. But getting back to fit, I would say the heel is pretty comfortable. You can see that there's a little bit of structure to the heel counter, but there's still quite a bit of flexibility there. You can see the heel collar has a little bit of padding, but overall it's pretty thin. I mean, there's a reason the shoe weighs less than 6 ounces. The laces are pretty minimal, but I had no issues with lockdown. The one thing that I didn't really like, which I'm going to try to show you guys, is you can see the tongue. There's no gusseting at all. And when you put it on your foot, there's a lot of material on the side. And I definitely found that it would fold up. So it took a little bit of finagling to just get the tongue to sit flat on the top of my foot. I think I wrote in the review, like, if I was doing a triathlon, I wouldn't choose this shoe because your transition time would be a little bit longer, just making sure the tongue is in the right place.
Right.
But overall, great fitting shoe. I was really happy with it from that perspective. What did you think, David?
Also, just one more thing. As the certified team tongue snob, I agree that the folding down on the sides was present. I've gotten one run in this shoe, and then I sent him over to DJ. And it's interesting because you were up a half size, David was down a half size. So, yeah, what do you got, David?
Yeah, I liked it overall. I think the upper itself is rather generous as far as width goes. I think it's like normal to slightly wide throughout, a little bit more forgiving for a performance-based shoe. Normally everything locks down real tight right around that heel, midfoot, forefoot. And being a half size down, I still didn't have any problems on the foot. I mean, obviously length is going to be a little bit shorter, but the toe box is still pretty darn wide for like a 5K, 10K shoe. And then same with the midfoot and heel there. I agree with everything Andrea was saying. The tongue does kind of move around a little bit, so that could be a little better. It does kind of crinkle on itself as well. I didn't really have any problems with the heel. I think the heel's actually done pretty well. Like, it's like semi-rigid, but it's still flexible enough. It just basically holds its structure. You know, it doesn't really do anything much besides that. Really lets you do what you want to do. But there's still like a little bit of like external reinforcement as well. Just like a little overlay that creates a little bit of extra rigidity down through that region. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think the upper throughout was pretty good. And I will say though, to second the triathlon comment, this upper holds water like I'm not going to say whatever, explicit. Did a workout in the rain in these, and like they clogged up. Like the whole thing, like the cloth material like really absorbed the water. And like the foam itself felt like it absorbed the water too. Like I would step and like I literally have water squishing out the side of my, just like not running, like just walking in between reps and stuff like that. So it was like, it felt real heavy trying to run like 30-second 200s in these at that point.
It
But
rains in Southern California.
Yeah, every once in a while, sometimes.
That's cool. So very rarely. Did you do any rain runs, Andrea, in this one?
No, I think I actually lucked out that none of my workouts in it were in the rain, and I was really happy to keep it looking nice.
Yeah, it looks...
Most of my shoes I ruin running in the bad weather. I think I did a couple runs where the roads were wet, and I didn't really have any traction issues, but definitely not like running through puddles or in downpour.
Sure. And that let's transition it to a little bit on the ride then. So how would you guys say, being a quote-unquote lower stack racing shoe, even though it's still robust enough, what did the shoe feel like? What's the foam like? Can you feel the plate? What do you think of the shaping of the plate? Anything involved with the ride? How was it?
It was interesting. Oh, go ahead, David.
No worries. Overall, I think it's pretty balanced throughout for being a 5K, 10K shoe. I think the category, at least traditionally, has always been thought of as like pretty aggressive, low to the ground, firm, snappy shoes. sometimes flexible in the forefoot, sometimes not. Just some examples that I pulled, like this is even just between one generation. I mean, this is the Adidas Takumi Sen 7. And so very low to the ground, very, very firm underfoot. Torsion system just kind of creates a little bit more rigidity through there. But it still has a decently flexible forefoot up front. That's kind of like the traditional build. This is essentially the Nike Streak LT, but the Japanese version. So, but yeah, Japan Speed, same idea. Like semi-rigid forefoot, but everything else is really rigid, low to the ground, very firm EVA. That's kind of like what most people for a long time have thought of as a 5K, 10K / cross-country even racer. And this takes a lot of that. I mean, it does have the carbon fiber plate. It does create a lot of rigidity throughout the platform, but it also gives you that really soft FuelCell midsole that some people love, some people don't. It's just a soft foam, right? And but it basically integrates those two, and the shoe reminds me a lot of like the Gomeb Speed 6, or even a baby between the Takumi Sen 7 and 8. The 8 feels like it's still a little bit higher up as far as the Adidas shoe comparison goes. This feels like you can go a little bit longer in it. It's a little bit more flexible up front than
Which one's
say
more
this
flexible?
one. The Takumi Sen 8
Okay, is more flexible
compared to the FuelCell or SC Pacer. So does have a lot of rigidity through that platform, but overall the transitions themselves I wouldn't call it aggressive. It feels pretty fluid throughout, even though it's still a flatter geometry compared to a lot of the high stack rockers that we're seeing. Traditionally, I do think from a geometrical standpoint, those shorter distances, they tend to flatten them out a little bit more because they want you to really get onto that forefoot and load it and use your own torque to create forward movement. With that said, though, it almost felt like it was a little overly stiff for me, and I don't know if that's just me not loading it like I should be loading it, or if it just maybe isn't the shoe for me. You could still run fast in it. I have no problem with it. I think it's a great shoe, but for whatever reason, I don't really notice it until I'm really turning over. And I'm just not running that fast for most of the race for me. And so I just think that forefoot, like I just don't quite load it enough, I think. I don't know.
Yeah,
but I'd be really curious to see what Andrea thinks. But I think from heel to midfoot, it's done quite well. And same with the forefoot. I just don't load it as much.
I would agree with a lot of what David just said. It is definitely a firmer shoe. It was interesting for me testing it after testing the Streakfly, which is basically like the opposite shoe to the Pacer. So the Streakfly is pretty flexible. And it actually performs more flexible than like I'm demonstrating here. It really feels like a traditional racing flat when you're running fast in it. Whereas the Pacer, I mean, I can't bend that much at all. So for me, the Pacer definitely felt more like what I was looking for like a 5K or 10K super shoe. I like that it's firmer. I like the balance between the plate and the foam. I like that it's lower stack. I've raced pretty much every race from marathon on down in the past, let's say, year and a half in the Vaporfly, the next percent. But like in 5K races in particular, the Vaporfly just feels too high stack, and it makes me feel like I can't feel the road, which is something that I like to feel. Now, the Vaporfly is plenty fast, and, you know, I've been happy with my performance in it. But as far as, like, being able to feel the ground when you're running faster, I liked how the Pacer felt. And I actually liked how the Pacer felt better than the Streakfly. I think because the Streakfly was just too flexible for me. It wasn't, there's no plate, you know, it has that P-back shank in the midfoot. So overall, the Pacer really checked a lot of boxes for me in what I would be looking for in like a 5K, 10K racer. I could definitely see myself running a half marathon in this shoe too, but then, you know, that makes you start thinking, well, would you be faster in a Vaporfly or an Alphafly? But as someone who's probably done, I think I've done 5 workouts in the Pacer of like 11 to 12 mile length, I can definitely say it's comfortable for those distances. David mentioned that he felt like he wasn't loading the forefoot enough. I don't really feel like I had that issue, but I would say, like, if I was racing a mile, then the pacer might feel a little too stiff, kind of like what you said. Like, I think if I was racing a mile, I would use the Streakfly. Like, I really think that's where Streakfly shines, is at those shorter distances.
So really quick comment that it's interesting you say, like, and I kind of, my assumption, without thinking about this too much, would be that, hey, you might want something that's stiffer for even shorter distances. But David alluded to this before. That doesn't always feel good, and that's going to depend on the person.
I kind of interpreted David. I interpreted David saying that he felt it better at faster. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
Like flip of that. Like David was saying, I didn't
yeah.
feel the plate until I went.
Gotcha.
I don't feel the plate. Yeah.
But it's interesting because the cushioning, I think I wrote this in the written. I think I did. I forget that I write reviews sometimes. But that it almost feels better when I slow it down a little bit. Like, I think that half marathon is definitely a wheelhouse that shoe can shine in, the SC Pacer. But it's weird because, like, I don't really feel like I'm getting much out of the actual plate itself until I turn over. And once I'm, like, really going, I mean, like, I don't know, like 5K pace right now, give or take, is like 4:42 a mile. So, like, if at that pace, it's like, it just feels a little off. But if I take it, say, 4:20 or faster, like, it feels like it's alive again. But if I slow it down, I can get into a rhythm at, like, say, 5:15 or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so what I was referencing, and I apologize for not introing this, is
all those are like faster than my 400 pace.
This is going to be relative, right? For your individual paces of, like, that's going to be David's really moving versus kind of some of the intermediate or slower paces for him, right? Which you're going to have to translate that to others. I think, David, what I was referencing, and I forgot to say this, is we talked in the past how you said, hey, when you really want to go fast, like all out fast, sometimes having just a little more of that flexibility actually felt good to you, correct? So I'm curious to know, what do you think, and this is a really difficult question, and the answer might be, I don't know, but what do you think is different between a shoe like the Takumi Sen that has rods and just has a little more flexibility versus something like the SC Pacer, in terms of why you think that might be opening up more at that faster pace?
Yeah, I think it brings a similar question to why there's the Nike Victory and the Nike Dragonfly as well. When you take a look at the Victory, you have the carbon plate with the AirPod right up front, and then you look at the Dragonfly and it's a Pebax plate. Both using Zoom X, but both very different shoes. And so if you're looking at the Victory, you got some guys running 400s in that too. You know, it's like 400, 800, 1500, and then like right at that 1500 is kind of where people start to make that decision, like, do I go Dragonfly or do I go Victory? And then if they go longer, then it's pretty much always Dragonfly, if we're talking consistent with the Nike line. I think there's something to going really fast that I like the rigidity underfoot, but I'm not running really fast in a 5K. You know what I mean? Like, it's still like you're going fast enough to where I want some rigidity, but I don't want it so rigid that I can't. I don't know. I like having a little bit of flexibility so that I can get into some rhythm, but I don't want it so I don't want it so stiff and so rockered that I feel like I can't push either, which I get in a lot of like the higher stack super shoes. So I think like the Takumi Sen, I think did a really good job of balancing that, because you do have a lot of like not a lot. I mean, it's still pretty rigid, right? Like, but it's definitely more flexible than the Pacer, and I haven't run in the Streakfly, but I'm willing to say it's a decent amount stiffer than the Streakfly, just based on everything I've heard.
Yeah.
Andrea, how do you feel about that stiffness at different pace levels?
That's a good question. And I mean, you know, Nathan like definitely shortened my athletic history. I've been running since I was 4.
Right.
So
yeah, sorry.
my running background, you know, I grew up on the track, right? So I grew up wearing spikes. I ran the 800 and the 400 and basically the 300 hurdles in high school. So I come from a background where I'm used to like a very stiff shoe, right? When you're running very fast. But I never ran the mile or the 5K or anything on the track because I didn't like it. I thought it was too long. But I did run cross country. So I wonder when it comes to like shoe preferences, right? It has to do with our motor planning patterns, right? And like my running background is different than like another person's running background, right? Like I've got certain movement patterns that have been ingrained since I was very small. Whereas someone who maybe started running in high school or only ran on the track or only did certain events might have a slightly different motor plan, and that makes them prefer a stiffer shoe at certain paces or a more flexible shoe at certain paces. I'd love to go on the track and like try to rip a 400 and see what I can do right now.
That'd be fun.
But I probably should train a little for that.
We'll do a DOR invite.
Yes, let's do that.
Please,
So-
for my peace of mind, please don't make it a 400, please.
The fastest guy on the planet that can't break 60.
Yep. When you talk about motor planning, Andrea, let's dig into that a little bit. Can you define that a little bit for people? When do motor plans, on a day-to-day basis, when might we notice what a motor plan is? What's
sure.
going on? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, we use motor plans for everything we do. So, for example, getting dressed, how we put our pants on in the morning, or how we wash our hair, how we prepare breakfast, walk the dog. Any movement that we do, our brain has a pattern of recruiting our muscles that lets us do it most efficiently. So, for example, if someone decided to go take ballroom dancing lessons and they've never done it before, you're probably going to be pretty bad at it at first. But the more you practice, the more fluid it gets, the less you have to like look at your feet or look in the mirror. It becomes more natural. And you could say that about learning anything, right? Like learning how to do a handstand or learning how to do whatever. So the brain always tries to help us find the most efficient way to do a certain movement. And the more we practice it, the more our brain refines that pathway. And, not to go too far down the rabbit hole here, but a really cool thing about the brain is if there's damage to the brain, or if there's damage to, let's say, a muscle or a nerve root, whatever, your brain can actually make new pathways to help you do the same thing, but using different neurons in a slightly different pathway. So when getting back to Nathan's question, everyone who runs a little bit differently, right? And there's no one best way to run. Like if you looked at the top marathoners, if you looked at the top 400-meter runners, there's such great variation in how they run, which is actually kind of surprising, right? Like you'd think the best people in the world would look similarly, but they don't. So for each one of them, their movement history, let's say their running history, has led them to that particular running gait pattern that's most efficient for them. So, you might see some marathoners who run crossing their arms across their body, and technically that's supposed to be less efficient. But if you forced them to stop doing that, guaranteed you would decrease their running economy and make them slower. So I think it would be a fascinating area of study, and maybe Matt can comment on it, but how a person's individual motor planning, running background, movement background influences how they run, the shoes they like. I think that's probably a big part of the future of running shoe selection.
And I can speak on that, is that's where things are going. So one of the common article that we reference is McLeod's study on individual responses to shoe stiffness. And we found is that, again, there is no best way to design a plate. And that's the great thing about now is we have a variety, because people's individual movement patterns, right, how they are accomplishing the running stride, their joints and their bones, the structure is going to be different. So where they pivot off of is going to be totally different, which means different levels of stiffness and different types of stiff. I'm not going to say plates, because there's more than one way to create stiffness in a shoe. Right. But how that's going to be optimized for each person is going to be totally different, because our gait and our movement patterns are as unique, if not more unique, than our fingerprints. This is very common for especially PT students who, as they start going through gait analysis in their early years, all of a sudden start picking up their classmates, not by how they look, but by how their movement patterns are. And that's something that happened to me. And I'm like, oh, that's Tim. All right, that's coming. And like, I can't even see him yet because my vision's so terrible. I can tell his movement pattern. So, yeah, it's gonna vary, and that's where another group of studies we reference is Dr. Ben O'Nig's talk about the preferred movement pathway. It's going to be unique to each person, and footwear, the goal is going to be supporting that individual, and that's why each shoe is probably not going to work for everybody. And that's what we're hoping with Doctors of Running, is to help educate people about going, how can they find what works best for them, because it may not work for their neighbor or their rival or their best friend. It's a personal journey. And so that's where, and Andrea, I totally agree that the industry is going to probably moving towards, how do we optimize this for the individual? We talked to Matt Trudeau the other week about how, that same thing they're working on. You're going to see this more often.
Yeah, and Matt Trudeau is kind of the brainchild of preferred movement path stuff. He worked with Benno too, but he kind of has been pushing that forward and how they design things at Brooks from a comfort standpoint. And shoe matching to people is what's their preferred movement path. And you can go listen to that episode. I forget the number, but it's a number of episodes ago with Matt Trudeau, and he talks on that.
I think one thing unique too, just to bring up gait and biomechanics as well, is that it changes. And that, to go back off of the motor planning conversation, I think our body's constantly making this unconscious anticipation, preparation, and adaptation to the things that are going on in front of you while you're running. So whether it's a cross-country course and you're going up a hill or you're going down a hill, you have to make a sharp right, you got to make a U-turn, or you're just making constant lefts on the track. That matters. And that's just one piece of the puzzle. That's not taking pace into account at all. And so everyone has their own preferred movement pathway, but they also have the preferred motor plan for what they're doing. So like, even if you're taking it outside of running, if you take a look at, say, someone like Steph Curry going down and he's driving on a fast break, that's not the same way he runs when he's dribbling up the court. There's different demands for different responses.
No one cares about the Warriors, David. No one cares.
I was just waiting for Nathan to just dump on this.
Actually, I really want the Warriors to win for obvious reasons. But when we're recording, the finals has not started yet, so we don't know anything. But
I'd like to give
I really want the Warriors to win.
On the topic of movement patterns, a really great article I want to shout out is from one of our previous guests, is Jeff Burns, who wrote a great article on the bouncing behavior of 4-minute milers. And interestingly enough, it was on the same topic, looking at what movement patterns do they decide. And what was interesting is doing elite versus sub-elite, how they change their mechanics when their speed change was totally different. And I'm going to encourage people to go read that. But it's fascinating to go, how do we decide to move, and how does each individual decide to move? And that's, again, creates even more variability, which is really interesting.
Yeah, because even just from personal experience, like that 5K I did a couple weeks ago, like the first 4,600 meters of that race, my mechanics were very, very different than the last 800.
Andrew, I'm really curious. One of the things, this is totally off topic, and Nathan, tell me to be quiet if we were going too long. But, always talking about like mechanical changes, the thing I always think about is a triathlete who's going from biking for, if you're doing an iron level of a competition, like you've been on that for 100+ miles, and now you've got to suddenly switch to running. Is there research on that transition in terms of like what happens? And
well,
endless, right?
Yes. So just briefly, you set up somebody on a triathlon bike differently than you would on a road bike. A person on a triathlon bike, their seat is further forward, which reduces the recruitment of their hamstrings when they're pedaling. So that when you get off the bike and start running your marathon or whatever, your hamstrings aren't already taxed from riding the bike 112 miles if you're in an Ironman. But getting back to motor planning, a big part of any triathlete's preparation is doing a lot of brick workouts where you do a bike ride and then you immediately go run. Because, again, you're trying to make that motor plan, okay, teaching your body, how do I run when I immediately get off the bike? So as we see with sports, with, any skill-based sport, the more practice you get, the better you are. And a big part of that is you're improving those neural pathways that help you do whatever movement you're trying to do.
Cool. I'm going to bring it back to the SC Pacer for one more question, and then we'll move on to our next segment. But one of the designs that is being kind of pushed forward by New Balance right now is the Energy Arc design and shaping of the plate. Do you guys have any thoughts on that design? Do you think that there's potentially, we hopefully will learn from them in terms of, I'd love to talk to their researchers and their, their department there to see kind of what they've been finding. But do you think there's anything there from a performance standpoint in the shaping of that plate?
Potentially. There's another shoe I can't talk about that has a very similar plate geometry that I like a lot. But
Classic David, just like, oh yeah, I'm going to compare it to the shoe no one can know about.
But yeah, why not? I mean, depending on how rigid the plate is, but if there's a certain flex you can get while you load it from the heel into the midfoot and then it spoons off, there's a potential for potential energy and then creating kinetic energy. So just from a physics and torque standpoint, in theory, there's a possibility it could work, but I think the person's individual biomechanics would dictate that and the interaction with the rest of the shoe, because it could very easily fight you as well. So it's depending on where you're landing on that apex, you know?
Right.
So, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Andrea?
Yeah, I would really like to know more, anything about New Balance's research on Energy Arc, why they decided to use it, what properties of it led them to put it in the Pacer. Because I agree, they must have seen something in their research that told them that that shape was better for like the 5K, 10K distance. But what is it? I can't really say when I was running in it that I felt like the plate was really like the part that made me like the shoe. Right. And as we know from other research, the plate really doesn't contribute that much to improvements in running economy. It's the foam that provides more energy return. So again, let's see what New Balance has to say about Energy Arc and why they actually decided to use it.
And we are planning to have them on the podcast, so we know we'll get to ask them questions. So we'll
great.
If you have questions for New Balance, drop them below if you're on YouTube, and we can ask them the questions. I think the Energy Arc, from what I saw from the running event and some of the they're going to carry that through even their higher stacked racers too. So I think that the shaping of the plate will carry through. So it will be curious to ask them those questions. When they talk about the shaping, you look at it, I kind of referenced it before, it does look like a cross-country ski where you're kind of like bouncing into the idea would be you flatten it out, and then as you're coming off the ski, it provides some energy return up. And it'd be curious to see if they've found that actually happens with a plate sandwiched in foam. But any other final thoughts on the SC Pacer?
No.
Yeah, I guess with how rigid the plate is, like Andrea was saying, I didn't really notice that much plate involvement per se.
Sure.
I mean, besides the fact that it was a really rigid shoe.
Yeah.
I mean, everything felt pretty balanced. I really liked the shoe. I don't want it to come off like I didn't, but I think it was a little too, rigid in the forefoot for me personally. But those that are sensitive to plates, this still might work fine. Like, I didn't feel it because of the plate. It was more just the stiffness.
Could you guys warm up in it fine and cool down, or was it one of those, it's too X, Y, or Z? Okay.
No, it's great at slower paces. I could use it for the whole workout, no problem.
Cool. That's
Trail
a big
shoe.
deal. A trail shoe. It's not a trail shoe.
Not a trail shoe.
What do you got?
Question. I have not tried it yet, so I might have a pair coming or I might not. This is something I'm always curious in, especially racing shoes, right? Because the uppers are really thin. For those that might have some Achilles or heel sensitivity, how's the heel counter?
It's very nice.
Very nice.
No
Okay.
issues. Yeah, because I am sensitive to heel counters, and it's there, but it doesn't impinge anything. There's not a ton of padding, and it has the little elf heel that New Balance puts on other shoes, but that's completely not noticeable.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, let's transition to our next segment. We're going to be diving into biomechanics again. And today we're talking about something you may or may not have thought about, depending on where you're at in your running nerdism. I don't know if that's a phrase, but
that is now.
We're going to be talking. It is now. We're going to talk about the importance of hip extension in runners. So to start this topic off, Matt, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what hip extension is in general, and when do we see it in the running cycle?
Yeah. That's a great question. So hip extension refers to when, specifically at the hip joint, so it's a multiplanar joint. It can do a bunch of different things. So flexion is when the hip joint, so femur especially, comes forwards. Extension is when it travels backwards. Normal for hip flexion, again, most runners don't ever get to this level unless they're doing some crazy trail run, is about 120 degrees for flexion. Hip extension is kind of argued where the normal amount that we're taught in school is about 20. How many people actually get that? 20 degrees, I'm sorry. How many people? So that's, again, this is your pelvis, the femur is going to come back behind you, right? Supposedly it's 20 degrees. How many people actually get that? Might be a different story, especially with how much we sit. But that's a whole nother conversation. Why it's really important is that as your foot in the lower extremity are traveling behind you, you got to have enough range of motion at the hip to really get into a position where you can push off from your ankle and push you forwards here. If you don't have enough hip extension and you toe off, you're going to be more going upwards, which that may cause you to bounce more, may not be the most efficient. But we're going to dive into more about what too much or not enough hip extension may do for you.
Yeah, and I think you hit it important just to shape it for everybody. If somebody's doing marching for like marching band, that's moving into flexion. The opposite of that will be extension. You use it as you're doing push off in the back of your running cycle. When you're running, do people run with the same amount of hip extension regardless of what they're doing, or does the type of running activity you're doing, dictate how much extension you use or need?
Yeah, like Andrea was talking about earlier in terms of motor programs and our movement patterns, it's going to vary depending on your speed. If you're doing a shuffling run, your recovery jog, or you're like me this morning where my legs are really trashed, I'm doing the old man jog, which ironic is my normal movement pattern most of the time.
I was going to say, this is normal, right?
Yeah, that is normal. We haven't posted the video yet of you looking at me while I was warming up, and you're like, is that painful? I'm like, no. Anyway,
I think I put it in the story that day.
Got it. Oh, that's
gone
right.
Forever.
No. Back on track finally. You're going to use different amounts depending on the motion you have available and what you're doing, right? So if you're running faster, your stride may, depending on the person, may lengthen, so you might need more hip extension there. If you're doing, running very slowly, you might have a shorter stride, you might need less. So it's going to depend very much on terrain, speed, personal factors, lots of things.
Cool. And why, you touched on it a little bit, Matt, but Andrea, maybe if you want to speak to the ideas of why do we use it and kind of what functions does it have in the running cycle?
Oh, I'll go ahead.
Yes.
So when your foot hits the ground, like when at initial contact, your glutes actually turn on. So your glutes are your butt muscles. Those are your main hip extensor muscles that are going to help you get your leg from that forward kind of marching position to the back, like kicking position. So interestingly enough, your glutes actually start firing while your foot is still in the air. And that's a good example of something called muscle tuning, where your brain is actually anticipating the impact that your foot is about to make. So your glutes fire before your foot hits the ground to help you absorb some of that impact of hitting the ground, and then immediately helping you push back or push off and extend your leg. One of the other important functions of hip extension is actually to create a stretch reflex in your hip flexors. So as you push off and your foot comes off the ground, your hip flexors are in a stretched position. And that essentially makes your hip like a slingshot. So as you push off, that stretch response is going to help to pull your leg forward while your foot is off the ground. So not only are your hip extensors, your glutes, active in the pushing off phase when your foot is on the ground, they set up your hip flexors to act like that slingshot to help you come back forward. Interestingly enough, when you look at like the total energy use throughout the running gait cycle, only about 15% of energy is used during swing phase. The rest of the energy, 85%, is when your foot is on the ground. And we can get a little bit more into later maybe some things that people have been taught incorrectly about what to do when they're running and what you could maybe focus more on to help you run more efficiently and smoothly.
I think you pointed out a lot of important things there, but I think one of the distinctions you kind of talked about was active hip extension and passive hip extension. So I have this with students that I work with, physical therapy students, when they talk about, this is elbow extension, but you're using your biceps for elbow extension. Kind of that combination of muscles need to be able to stretch. They need to eccentrically contract to control a movement. So you talked about how the glutes, the hip extensors, help bring the hip into extension and bring you there. But as you move into hip extension, something is happening in the front, and that's stretching the muscles in the front of the hip. I think you talked about the stretch reflex, and part of why that happens has to do with like kind of the makeup of the tissues of tendons and of muscles. And our tendons and muscles have some level of elasticity to them. So they're mainly made of different types of collagen and then some kind of elastin. And there's not a ton in there, but it's kind of like we're not as elastic as a rubber band where when you stretch it, then it recoils right away, or a spring that when you push it in, it comes back exactly. But when you put a stretch through a tendon, it increases the force generation capacity of that muscle, even if you don't do anything. And that's what you were talking about with that kind of slingshot where you bring the hip flexors into extension. It activates some of that passive elastic nature of those to drive the hip forward as you propulse off the foot. And that has to do viscoelasticity. If you want to nerd out on that, you can look up viscoelastic properties, stress strain curves. There's lots of things that you could dig into. But that's part of that process of getting the hip into extension. And then you don't have to use a lot of energy if you're doing it right, because you've activated passive structures to do the job for you versus having to like lift your foot forward. You referenced things that people have been told wrong. Why don't we go there right now? We can always circle back to other things. What kind of things do you think people have been cued on that may not be the most accurate?
Well, I think one of the most common is kicking your butt when your foot comes off the ground.
That was the first thing I thought of.
Yeah. So I've probably spent, months of my life over my lifetime doing butt kicks as part of running drills, right? And those can serve a good purpose for dynamic mobility, but when you're actually in the act of running, you should actually not try to kick your butt, because the natural spring-like and passive movement that occurs when you push off, your heel is going to come up to your butt anyway. Basically, your lower leg is going to fold up whether you think about doing it or not. So if you think about doing it by using your hamstrings to help you kick your butt, you're just wasting energy because you're forcing something to happen that would have happened on its own anyway.
Also puts you at risk for like overworking the hamstrings, because the hamstrings function really is when you're pushing off, that power from the push off as well as the eccentric like reaction, the stretch reflex from the hip flexors, that's going to pull and bend that knee anyway, right? For efficiency's sake.
Right.
The hamstrings function is really to slow down the tibia as it comes forward toward the end. So if you're already overactivating, you're using that more than necessary, you've already fatigued it out. And the most the hamstrings are going to work are later in the swing phase, not earlier, right?
I think
Right.
Additionally to that too, you want to move into hip flexion during the swing phase, and hamstrings are hip extenders as well as knee flexors. And so you're creating co-contraction around a joint that's basically just fighting yourself to achieve a motion that's going to happen naturally. Any other cues you feel like that have been thrown out there that may not be accurate?
I've definitely been told at various points in my running life that you're supposed to paw the ground when your foot hits the ground. Have you guys heard of?
When I
So
Go into
recently, I felt Andrea, I'll let you go first, but I had a moment where I felt really dumb during my dissertation when I was studying like what part of the stance phase of Masters of None I should be looking at, and then I realized that whole cloth thing. I was like, oh, that does not work.
No.
Go first. And I'll add in how
Don't
I was
paw
like,
the
wow.
ground.
Yeah, why that does not work.
So another cue that I've been told in the past, and I'm sure that others have been told in the past, is when you're at like the end of swing phase and your foot is about to hit the ground, you're supposed to take your foot and imagine that you're pawing it, like almost grabbing the ground with the front of your foot. And I think the idea behind that is to help you activate your hamstrings more at initial contact. But again, that's going to happen without you thinking about it. One, so there you're wasting energy. And two, pawing the ground makes you overstride, which can really, it increases braking force. It throws off your center of mass. So don't paw the ground. It's not necessary.
Yeah, I when I think of running, I mean, I still consider hip flexion and hip extension an arc of motion. And running as a motion is very cyclical. And if you look at someone who does it well, it looks like a nice, pretty circle. They're not overstriding. They're not. Their hips are going back, but they're not going so far back they can't control the motion. And so they're using that stressed reflex. They're using that circular motion, getting that heel up to the butt, getting that limb to advance, but not so far that they can't bring it back underneath them and repeat that process. And so one of the drills that I like to do a lot to practice that cyclical motion, it's a little bit of a hybrid of a butt kick and a C-skip. And so I think there's still some merit to some of the pawing neuromuscular activation things, but it's not so much pawing from the hamstrings as much as it is practicing the cyclical motion and changing cadence. And so like taking a couple stuff like where you are jogging, and then like say you take a step on right, left, and then when you come back on that right, you snap it up, but you don't snap it up like a butt kick where you're bringing it straight to your butt. You're getting a little bit of hip extension, you're rising that heel and rotating it up forward like you would in a stride, like as if you're about to go into a sprint or something like that. Getting it up over and then kind of snapping it down in front of you, but not snapping it like you're trying to grab the ground per se. It's just a quick, fast stride, and then you catch yourself, and then you go 1, 2, and then the next one, and you repeat that process. And so you do that for maybe 3, 4 cycles, and then go into a stride. And so you're practicing neuromuscular adaptation for the circular motion that is running, rather than a straight paw or straight leg bound or a B-skip or things like that. Not to say that they don't do anything from a neuromuscular standpoint. I think there is still a lot of merit in some of these drills, but I think it is important to practice that cyclical nature that is running.
I think another realm of what all of these drills can be for and how we can think about them is simply to warm up the structures and the muscles, like get through the range of motion that's required, maybe even a little more, so that when you go open up for a workout, it's not the first time the muscles have done the job, or at least part of the job. It's a really great way to warm up.
Yeah, and same goes for same goes for strides before the run or race or workout. Yeah. Because it's like the last thing you want to do is start the workout or race and be like, oh crap, like my legs aren't ready for this. So regardless of physiologically, you are ready for it, you know? Mm-hmm. So if you get the strides in, get used to, do a couple pace checks, get your legs warm and ready to roll. So that way, when you do enter the race and or workout, your body isn't freaking out in that first 100 to 200 meters, because that nervous system will give you a lot of different signals over the next mile.
Right.
And that might change your race day. So.
Right.
The whole purpose of a warm-up, well, I mean, there's many purposes, but you're not going to feel great during your warm-up because you're getting all of that junk out in the warm-up so you don't feel bad during your race, right? Like at the most basic level, that's the point of a warm-up. So yeah, you don't want to just roll out of bed, go out the front door and start doing a tempo workout or something. You want to ease your body into it. And as I'm sure Matt can tell us, as we get older, that's even more important.
Yeah, it takes a little longer to warm up, and that making sure you've got enough blood flow and got the engine going a little bit is really, really important. I think a lot of younger individuals get away with that, but I would encourage them to still think, hey, in terms of longevity, you might want to consider taking the extra time just to make sure all cylinders are ready to go.
And part of that change is the change in the composition of our muscles and tendons as we age. So I kind of referenced that there's collagen, and then there's elastin, and there's also proteoglycans, which have water compounds within, help hold water within your muscles and tendons and stuff. The amount of elastin and proteoglycan changes as we age, which is why it does take longer to get things warmed up. That's one of the reasons. That's a piece of the puzzle. So we've talked a little bit about what is hip extension, when do we use it, why it's important. Let's talk a little bit really briefly. Let's try to keep this part brief. How do we measure hip extension, and why might people be lacking hip extension, both statically and dynamically?
This is a very complex question. So one of the ways in PT school you're taught classically is the Thomas test, right? So if somebody's laying supine on the table, they do that classic where one leg's up, and the professor always looks super cool because they got one leg on them and they get the leg down, like, oh, I'm so good at this. So, just kidding. That was just a significant memory. So every time I do the Thomas test, like, make sure you look cool while you do this. But generally, that's one way of measuring it. Typically, that doesn't always correlate to how much people use, right? Because just because you see a passive range of motion. So again, you're letting the leg just fall, right? So supposedly they're supposed to relax. There's several muscles that can restrict that motion. So you got to see which one might be restricting that. But the problem is static measurements don't always translate to dynamic measurements. Oftentimes it's a little better to look at this doing gait analysis or biomechanical analysis, and you'll generally look at the angle of the trunk and pelvis versus the femur, and going how, when that leg gets behind them, at what point do they get that maximum motion. So how we measure it statically versus dynamically, biomechanically, can vary a little bit.
And what's so difficult about hip extension measurements is that the hip is not this isolated joint. The hip is connected to the pelvis, which is connected to the lumbar spine.
Right.
And those joints work in concert with each other all the time. And so your ability to isolate the pelvis and the low back from the hip is really difficult to do. Even in controlled clinical settings, it's really easy to have compensations. Let's say you were watching somebody running and it looks like their leg is, or a dancer might be a better example. Somebody's doing like an arabesque or some other movement behind them, and it looks like their hip is in 90 degrees of extension. Right. But really their low back is extended, which translates to pelvic anterior rotation, which pairs to what looks like hip extension. And so if you're looking at it by yourself, I think it's just really hard to do. To know, are you achieving the right amount of hip extension? I think that if you're going to look at a runner, having the ability to look at pelvic tilt to get a general idea of what sort of pelvic tilt, meaning kind of forward and backward rotation of your pelvis. And if you're looking at someone from the side, if you can get an idea of what sort of pelvic tilt they're getting, that can give you a clue into how much lumbar extension they're in, which then can help balance out how much hip extension are they getting, or how much are they just getting from their back. Any other thoughts on that stuff?
When it comes to gait analysis, I really encourage people you can train your eyes to do this, but you really need to use video software, because the research suggested that our eyes really can't detect anything if it's less than like 5 to 10 degrees, and sometimes even then it's not great. So and the speed at which a lot of this stuff is happening, you need to video it and slow it down. The majority of like phones out there have this capability, right? Where you can just video something and then just slow it down. Use that. Don't just use your eyes, because that's not super valid or reliable.
Yeah, and I think some of this roots back too to some of the individual characteristics of gait and what makes each person unique. I almost check to just make sure they're getting hip extension first. Like, let's make sure that leg's getting behind you, and make sure you're not doing any funky things in order to get it behind you, such as, like rotating out, using excessive motion elsewhere, whether it's through the hips, through the thoracic spine, doing anything to kind of slingshot that leg forward or create circumduction or some other things where the leg is rotating away from you in order to clear that joint space so you can actually get that leg behind you. So I think I start there. It's like, let's just make sure we have it before I quantify what is quote unquote enough,
Mm-hmm.
And make sure that you are running okay first.
Right. As I agree with what Nate mentioned, that you have to look above the hip joint at the pelvis and at the lumbar spine. You need to look at SI joint alignment, sacral alignment, lumbar mobility. When you're walking or running, there's what we call reciprocal mobility at L5 and S1, so your lowest lumbar vertebrae and your sacrum. So if L5, S1 doesn't move normally, it's going to greatly affect your lower extremity mechanics when you're running. So you can't just do the Thomas test on somebody and say, oh, they're lacking extension. I think one of the biggest drawbacks of the Thomas test in particular for runners is when you do the Thomas test, someone has to be in a posterior pelvic tilt. You're flattening that curvature in the lower back. But that's not how we run. We want a little bit of anterior pelvic tilt for running. If you run in a posterior pelvic tilt, you're going to have a lot of problems. So the Thomas test is really a quite limited test for everybody, but in particular, it is a very limited test to use on runners because that's just not how runners use hip extension. But for PTs listening to this, you've got to look at the pelvis and the lumbar spine. If you're only looking at the hip, you're missing out on you're not getting even half of the picture of what's going on with your patient.
Because as both Nathan and Andrea mentioned, this is not just coming from the hip, right? So these are dynamic motions. These are whole body motions, right? The whole limb is acting as a spring. So a lot of the comments that you'll hear from different people, like, "Oh, you need to isolate this muscle." And it's like, okay, maybe if you're having some trouble initially with that, but then you need to integrate it back into the whole thing because we don't work in isolation. So it's just always interesting to me is people talk about hip extension, but then Andrew, you're mentioning it. Yeah, it's also coming from the ability to rotate your pelvis and then also mobility of the lower lumbar spine. Should we even call that, when people refer to how much your leg's getting behind you, should we even call that hip extension, or should that just be a general hip lumbopelvic extension? How should we quantify it? That's a question I'm actually hitting right now.
That's also why I was like, I kind of just focus on let's get some, make sure you just have it.
Is the leg getting behind you?
Yeah. Is it getting behind you? And are you doing it in an efficient manner? Because obviously there's multiple joints at play.
I think
for the PT students, don't freak out. Yes, you need to learn the Thomas test. You got to have a foundation first before you start going here. Don't freak out. It's not totally useless. Start somewhere.
Yeah.
Sorry, PT instructors.
That's okay. That's what they get.
I think one other concept, and again, I might be taking us down too big of a tangent, is to get the leg behind you when you push off and going into swing phase. It's not just your hip that helps you achieve that, right? Your knee and your ankle and your great toe help you get there too. So this might be something that Matt is looking at, but you could talk about total extension motion, and what percentage contribution the spine, the pelvis, the hip, the knee, the ankle, the great toe are contributing to that. And I would place a sizable wager that there are probably percentages that indicate that someone is more likely to get particular injuries than others. Matt, I would love to know if there's any research already in this realm, or if anyone has looked at this topic. What do you...
Yeah, when it comes, I'm blanking on the exact term, but this is done all the time in biomechanics literature. I think it's a joint power calculation, where based on movement and ground reaction forces, you can figure out how much a person is utilizing each joint, right? Each muscle is going to be different, right? Because then you need EMG and some other factors. But yeah, there's some early evidence about going, if we see you using this successfully, this might put you at this, but you have to realize the injury risk literature, especially in running, is really fuzzy. Right. It's really early. So to answer your question, they're the beginnings of it, but we need a lot more research first before you make any decisive conclusions.
Right. I mean, I think a common biomechanical characteristic that we see, not just with running, but any movement pattern, is the body will steal motion where it can, right? So if somebody is limited in extension, let's say at the hip, pelvis, lumbar spine complex, there's our term for that, then somebody may be more likely to rely on excessive plantar flexion to help them achieve push-off. And we know about lever arms, right? So basically your hip or your pelvis, somewhere in that area, is the pivot point for the limb when running. So a muscle that is closer to that pivot point is going to have to produce less force than a muscle that is further away from that pivot point to control that joint, right? So ideally, you would want the gluteal muscles, which are closest to that pivot point or joint, to help you get your leg behind you, as opposed to, say, your calf muscles doing extra work to help you get your leg behind you. So it may be that people who lack sufficient lumbar, pelvic, hip extension and overuse their plantar flexors might be more likely to get Achilles tendonitis or calf injuries. But
I think that's
again,
this is perfect to transition to the next section, which is on that topic of if you don't have enough hip extension, what areas might get stressed out. And this is actually one of the things I'm looking at in Masters Run, especially as our stride changes, right, and our mechanics change, what happens. So Andrea hit that on the head. If you don't have enough hip extension, you're going to have to find it from other places. So obviously, you got to start locally first before you start making crazy, going beyond certain areas. So pelvis and lumbar spine are going to be two areas that are going to deal with some of the stresses potentially first, right? So if you don't have enough motion at the hip, you're going to need more anterior pelvic tilt. You're going to need more extension at your lumbar spine. If somebody doesn't have the resiliency in those areas, that might be a place that might get stressed a little bit. The other area where I'm seeing right now is that if you don't have enough hip extension, you are going to toe off really early, right? So instead of, and I mentioned this earlier, optimally from a physics standpoint, you want to be able to get that leg behind you enough that you can control it, but also enough that when you toe off, it pushes you forwards rather than up. If you toe off early, right, your calves are going to be working way harder because now you're going directly against gravity rather than kind of working with a little bit and bouncing forward. So there's some early evidence that might stress the Achilles tendon, the calves more, which again, it's, this is it's issue with the hip, but it can stress other things down the chain. Same thing with the knee joint, right? We know that the more forward your knee goes over your toes, and I don't want to freak people out. I know there's the knee forward to toes guy out there.
Knee over toes guy.
Knee over toes guy. Sorry. But the more your knee comes forward over your toes when you're loading it, there is more stress on the patella and the kneecap. That's not going to be an injury issue for everyone, but for people that may not have tissue resilience there, if you don't have enough hip extension, your foot's going way behind your knee and you're loading that knee in a position that may not be optimal because you're not getting what's called triple extension, which I'm sure Nathan can speak about since he's written about that.
Yeah, for sure. And even before that, I think you just referenced something that's important to talk about, and it's when does the lack of hip extension become important for a runner?
Right.
And it's not for everyone all the time, but I think it matters in two realms. One is if you're having pain of some kind, you have to have that evaluation to see at what in pain. We talked about a couple areas, one being potentially the calf and Achilles, which it's funny how the hip can play a role in the calf and the Achilles. And the other one is talking about the low back and the pelvis and the SI region. And so this conversation becomes important when you're having pain or discomfort. It also becomes important when you want to run efficiently because of how important hip extension is in propulsion and running, in creating efficiency and speed within your running. And so if you're sitting here like, oh shoot, do I have enough hip extension? You don't have to freak out. It's probably important if you're developing some kind of soreness, or we can't always say prevention, but there's a possibility that having appropriate mobility and a good motor pattern can help with injury prevention. Just to touch on the other directions, you talked about how the calf can get overstressed. If you don't have a lot of hip extension, whether that's from the hip joint itself, like we talked about in a previous episode recently, David kind of mentioned it, talking about hip joint restrictions themselves around the bone. If you're having muscular tightness, or if you have a lack of a motor pattern that allows you to move there, if you still get your leg behind you, you're going to have to get that motion from somewhere. And like we just kind of referenced, it might result in anterior pelvic tilt, which is lumbar extension. And that can lead to a lot of compression in the lower back within the joints that get compressed as you go into lumbar extension or bending backward. And again, that's not an issue unless you don't have the tissue resilience to handle it. And so if you are having kind of lower back pain associated with your running, this could be one of those factors that your therapist would look at to kind of see, hey, do you have appropriate mobility at your hip, or are you overusing the motion in your low back, especially that lower lumbar region, to steal it because you don't have enough?
And for whatever reason, some people can handle having lots of lumbar extension and they never get injured, and don't ask us why, because, well, it's probably because certain people have the resiliency of those tissues to handle that, and others are not. So this is not a blanket statement going, hey, if you see this, this is what this means, which is the questions we get from a lot of students. It's no, you need to get a thorough history, understand what about this person might be contributing to this. And that's why a lot of the biomechanics literature about like optimal, elite performance, a lot of it went out the window in the late 90s because like we're seeing so much variability. These elite runners are using so many different movement patterns. It just seems like each person is so unique. They have to really optimize their performance. You have to figure out what works for this person and where people can handle that motion. It's going to depend on them.
Yeah.
And
so, go ahead.
Oh, that's a very good point, Matt, that for PT students or PTs listening, we can apply to everybody, right? Like, you can't protocol your patients. You have to evaluate each one as an individual. You have to look at their biomechanics, their strength, their alignment, flexibility, what their goals are, and figure out what interventions will be most beneficial for that individual. And I know, I remember back in PT school, you can't think that way because you're still learning. But the more clinical patterns you see, you start to learn that there's some variability between patients. You can start recognizing, oh, okay, I've seen this before. This particular thing is going to help this person the most. Or usually this combination of 7 things is going to help this person the most.
Right.
That's a perfect segue, though. I know you laid it out perfectly because it's going to so be individual. But if we think globally, what are some strategies to work on gaining hip extension, whether that's passively or in our running? David, you mentioned some drills that you talked about, so you can go back and listen to those. But any other ideas for gaining hip extension?
Yeah, I alluded to it in the previous episode a little bit as well. There is a pretty good book on it with self-mobilizations and things like that. And this is looking more at the localized joint level. But Becoming a Supple Leopard from Kelly Starrett gives you a lot of different self-mobilizations using the thick rogue bands where you can anchor it to something heavy. Granted, you have to have something heavy.
It's hard to find, actually, though.
It's hard. It is. If you have a tree or something nearby, I suppose those bands are long enough to work on the trees. But,
I have pulled a door off the hinges doing that.
I believe it. I 100% believe it because the amount of torque you have to get on the joint, especially on the hip, is rather high, right? But you can put yourself in a position that allows you to create what in the physical therapy world is a joint mobilization. So if you ever have someone where they're laying you on your stomach, they're supporting the kind of by your knee, a little bit above that, by the thigh, and they're lifting up your leg and they're putting their palm right at the base of the buttocks there, and they're kind of leaning into it and creating a mobilization on the hip. What they're doing is they're giving an anterior translation of that femur to help give that hip a little bit more extension. And so it's a little bit tricky, but there are ways where you can do that for yourself if this is truly a joint limitation. But you can put that band basically right around like that proximal kind of like inner groin region and have it go straight behind you. And then you essentially get into a lunge position, and keeping yourself relatively neutral up front, you lean forward. Not lean forward, hinge forward, like getting that hip forward and getting that hip into extension. So if I'm here, my leg's doing this. For the listeners, I'm like demonstrating like torso and body, leg, like you're kind of like kneeling here, and then leaning forward and getting more hip extension while that band is around your thigh there, pulling it back. So that's a self-mobilization. You could do the same thing too with a hip distraction, going to the side and doing a couple other things.
That was my favorite hand description ever.
Crushed it.
We'll just create a quick reel out of that.
Yeah.
But any others? Those were good, David.
What?
Andrew, you go first.
I would
Andrew,
say,
go first.
one, I am not as good at David as a hand demonstration, so I'll leave it be. But in addition to mobilizing the hip joint, perhaps reducing the amount of sitting that you do during the day. Our bodies respond to the conditions we put it under. So if you're sitting for 8 hours a day and spending 10 minutes a day stretching, It's probably not going to be enough to balance out. So if you have a desk job, get a standing desk or a very desk where you can alternate between standing and sitting. Think about how your non-running life might be affecting your body and see what you can do to improve it. But I would also just remind people that hip extension is not just about the hip joint. So you do have to have a therapist analyze pelvic mobility, spinal mobility. Something to also keep in mind, which not a lot of PTs talk about, is that if you have any sort of visceral issues, meaning like gut issues, or even like women's or men's health issues like menstrual cramps, that can actually limit your hip extension because of fascial and muscle guarding and spasm. So if you are sensitive to, let's say, gluten, then reducing gluten in your diet might actually, over time, improve your hip extension mobility. So don't neglect all of the non-muscular things that are in your abdominal region that could be affecting your running performance.
And that's a great point, because when I see runners and I see them lacking hip extension as part of my evaluation, and I ask them, what have you been doing? They've all been doing hip flexor stretching. Mm-hmm. It's not like that's not what runners do.
Right.
I think it's the other pieces that don't get touched.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to our final question. Sorry, Matt. I hope you're okay.
I'll just cry.
Our final question obviously has to do with shoes, because we have to talk about shoes. Well, we don't have to. We like to talk about shoes. When we think about hip extension, what'd you say, David?
He said talk about his hat.
I do like that.
So we
hat.
can talk about this hat.
The fractal hats have been really solid. They're super comfortable, in my opinion. Okay, how do we have an intersection between shoe types and hip extension? Are there things and components of shoes that either demand more or less hip extension that could be used as a tool? Yeah, Matt, you get to answer this
my
one.
hand. Okay, cool. We've actually gotten a ton of email questions about this recently. So different parts of the shoes are going to may facilitate or inhibit different parts of the gait cycle. So I'm not going to worry too much about the rear foot, because a lot of where you're going to get hip extension is as in terms of the gait cycle as you're from here forwards. So those people with really, really stiff ankle mobility, stuff like that, that can also be a reason you don't get a lot of hip extension, because your body goes, hey, I just can't get this at the ankle. I either don't want to go there, or I can, because the farther you go back, if you don't have that mobility, it's going to stress a lot of the tissue, and most people's bodies will go, nope, we're going to shorten this up. So if you've been stretching your hip flexors and it's not changing anything, another thing is obviously you need to work with somebody who can look at you from a whole body approach and going, where is your body limiting this, or why is it doing that? Now,
sorry, before you get into the shoes, I think we should just reemphasize what you said.
Yeah.
Because we didn't have an example like this yet, where something distally affects what happens proximally. So you said the lack of ankle motion, because you can't go into enough dorsiflexion, you start advancing the limb before you let your leg go behind you, because you don't have the motion for it. So just remember, it can go both ways. Things affect from top, bottom, and bottom up. So, all right, go ahead, though.
It does really go both ways. I know a lot of people get stuck on going one versus the other. It goes both, right? Bodies are not that simple. Sorry. Yeah. But something that can really push you. So let's say you have a lot of limited ankle mobility, right? We talk about how a forefoot rocker can help facilitate that motion forwards. Whether that's good for everyone is a different conversation, right? Because if you don't have enough hip extension, you have a shoe with a lot of a large forefoot rocker, that's gonna again start towing you off and allow you to potentially go into more of that motion. So for some people that have a little muscular guarding up top, a lot of toe spring, or I should say forefoot rocker, can actually put a little bit more stress at the hip. For people that don't have that motion and need it, this can also help facilitate that a little bit. So it's obviously going to depend on them. So the front half of the shoe can make a big impact on how much or how little you can get into that. I can't talk into that hip extension.
Great.
My brain stopped. Sorry. Need more coffee.
Rocker may demand more hip extension.
Yes,
if we were to
thank
put
you.
it in one
Rocker.
sentence.
Yes.
Would you say
Thank
then
you.
vice versa? A shoe that would be more traditional geometry, like the, Velocity from Puma, would potentially demand less? Or would that mean it just puts more on what your body does?
I think it's going to put more on what your body does, because that's going to require, and somebody correct me if you have a different opinion, but it's a more traditional stuff. They're going to typically have more flexibility in the forefoot. So The forefoot rocker, we're really just talking about how much movement can we get here, right? So if you have a lot of flexibility up front and you have enough toe mobility, that might do the same thing, right? But it's just, again, we've seen a lot of people with the amount of forefoot rocker can definitely, that regardless of whether it's a lot of flexibility here or a large forefoot rocker, you may get a little bit of the same. It's just going to depend on how people are using their individual movement patterns. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, all comes down to that motor plan.
Okay.
Comes back to the motor plan. Any other thoughts on shoes? I think for me, the biggest one in my head was the presence of a rocker that may increase demand. We've just talked about how if it decreases load somewhere, it'll increase it somewhere else. And I think part of that is what you see with rockers is it pushes load up the chain. And so it's active and passive demand, potentially. Anything else?
I agree with everything you guys just said. I would also say that in addition to maybe demanding more hip extension range of motion, it puts more demand on the hip extensor muscles, particularly the glutes. I know that with certain super shoes, the first few times I've run in them, I've definitely had some like glute, high hamstring soreness after running in them because it helps you transition into terminal stance faster. So it's requiring greater force output from those muscles. Have you guys experienced that?
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of patients who jump into some of the super shoes, and one of the major things they'll complain about is hamstring soreness or irritation, just because it's driving you really far back, a lot further actually than frequently these muscles are active. And I've got a comment that I want to challenge all of you with, and let me know if you think I'm nuts. So a lot of the biomechanics literature. So this is when that's fine. So you have stance phrase, right? That's where your foot's on the ground. You've got the first half, which is dealing with shock absorbent. You're landing on the ground. Your body's got to deal with the forces, and it'll figure out how to turn them into propulsion. You've got the second half of stance phase, again, when your foot's on the ground, where you're really starting to push off and generate force. Now, those terms may not actually be the best because from some of the biomechanics literature I'm running, I'm seeing your hip extensors are actually most active during the first half of stance. And they tend to get way more quiet during the second half, which is when your calf is really doing most of the work, and that's where that becomes one of the most important propulsive muscles. So a lot of the challenge about going, hey, you got to, I've seen lots of people talk about doing glute exercise into tons of extension that's supposed to improve your performance. That's actually not where they're super active, right? Their activity is mostly in that first half, generating some momentum, and then it's supposed to go, hey, we go quiet, right? So that as you can start doing that stress reflex from the hip flexors to start going the other way and pull you back. Where my kind of suspicion on some of that irritation might be, and this is going to probably go into swing phase as well, that you're getting pushed into hip extension so quickly, especially with the aggressiveness of the forefoot rocker, the plate, the foam, that your muscles are actually, those glute muscles and hamstring muscles are staying on longer into a very shortened range of motion, and muscles tend to not do super well when they're either super short or super long. So I wonder if that might be one. I'm sure there's something else, but might be one of the things that's contributed to some of that hamstring soreness and strains. What do you think? Is that nuts?
I think
makes sense to me.
And I think that was a classic Matt answer to what shoe is going to put more demand on hip extension.
My bad.
Phenomenal. Well,
this is why we have the sub twos, by the way, because it gets me to stop talking.
No, this is wonderful. This has been a really fun round table to have four of us on here and to bounce some ideas off of each other. SC Pacer is a shoe that you guys both have had success with, and it's fun to dig into some of the specs. If you have more questions about it that we did not hit here, you can refer to our full review on doctorsofrunning.com. You can also drop questions below, and we will do our best to answer them. And I loved hearing everybody's thoughts on hip extension, and we love talking about biomechanics. It's what we do every day. So if you have any more questions for us in that realm, please feel free to drop questions below. If you're on YouTube, if you're listening, you can reach out to us at doctorsofrunningpodcast@gmail.com. And we look forward to the next episode.